Dearest listeners, there exists no torment quite so exquisite as the shattering of a dream constructed over 23 years. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most devastating tale of a bride abandoned at the altar, not for lack of wealth, beauty, or breeding, but for something far more cruel, the awakening of her betrothed's heart to another. But let us not rush through such delicious agony, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. In the spring of 1818, Miss Georgiana Talbot stood at her bedchamber window in the grand estate of Ashfield Park, gazing across the manicured gardens of Derbyshire with the composed expression she had perfected over years of careful training. At 23, she embodied everything a future countess ought to be: graceful in deportment, accomplished in the feminine arts, and blessed with a serene countenance that revealed nothing of the romantic dreams she harbored in the privacy of her thoughts. While other young ladies of the ton learned Italian and French as fashionable accomplishments, Georgiana had mastered 4 languages with fluency that would shame a diplomatic attaché. Her musical proficiency extended far beyond the acceptable rendering of popular ballads at the pianoforte. She could discuss composition theory with professional musicians and play complex concertos that left audiences spellbound. More unusually for a woman of her station, she had been tutored in estate management, agricultural reform, and household economics, for the Harrington properties were vast and would require a mistress of exceptional capability. The portrait of perfection she presented had been cultivated with meticulous care from her very first breath. Lord Talbot, her father, had signed the betrothal contract binding his infant daughter to Robert Fitzwilliam, the infant son and heir of the Earl of Harrington, when both parties were scarcely 3 months old. Such arrangements were not uncommon among the aristocracy, where alliances between great families superseded the frivolous notion of romantic attachment. The Talbots brought ancient lineage and prosperous estates across 3 counties. The Fitzwilliams offered a title of impeccable standing and political influence that reached the very corridors of Carlton House. Yet beneath this cultivated exterior, Georgiana harbored sentiments she dared share with no one. During the 6 formal meetings she had been permitted with Robert Fitzwilliam over the years, all conducted under the watchful eyes of their respective families, she had constructed elaborate fantasies about their future together. His dark hair and aristocratic bearing, the brief moments when his gray eyes had met hers with what she interpreted as warmth, the formal notes he had sent expressing satisfaction with the arrangement. All these fragmentary encounters had been transformed in her imagination into the foundation of a grand romance. She did not love him, not truly, for how could one love a near stranger? But she had created in her mind an idea of who he was, who they would become together, and this phantom relationship had sustained her through years of preparation. In her most secret thoughts, she imagined passionate declarations, intellectual companionship, and the gradual deepening of affection that would blossom after their wedding. The reality that their union was a business arrangement mattered not. Countless marriages of convenience evolved into partnerships of genuine regard, and Georgiana had convinced herself theirs would follow this pattern. The Talbot household existed in a state of pleasant prosperity, sustained by careful management of resources accumulated over generations. Lord Talbot, though possessing neither the brilliance of a political mind nor the charm of a society favorite, governed his estates with conscientious attention to duty. Lady Talbot, a woman of refined sensibilities but limited imagination, concerned herself primarily with maintaining social connections and ensuring her daughter's accomplishments reflected well upon the family name. Into this ordered existence, 2 years previous, had arrived Lady Sophronia Talbot, a young cousin orphaned by the simultaneous deaths of her parents in a carriage accident on the treacherous roads of Cornwall. At barely 16, Sophronia had possessed nothing save her bloodline and a small inheritance insufficient to secure her future independently. The Talbots, bound by familial duty and genuinely moved by the tragedy, had welcomed her into their household with the understanding that she would be prepared for a respectable marriage, though naturally one of lesser consequence than Georgiana's illustrious match. Where Georgiana embodied controlled elegance, Sophronia radiated spontaneous vivacity. Her laughter rang through the corridors of Ashfield Park with unguarded delight. She approached every experience with enthusiastic curiosity rather than calculated refinement. When instructed in watercolors, she painted with bold, imperfect strokes that captured emotion rather than technical precision. When taught to play the harp, she favored lively folk melodies over the approved repertoire. Her conversations sparkled with genuine interest and unfiltered observations that occasionally bordered on the inappropriate. Initially, Georgiana had viewed her cousin with a mixture of affection and faint condescension. Sophronia was charming in her artlessness, rather like a spirited kitten tumbling about the drawing room. The girl clearly required guidance to navigate society successfully, and Georgiana had taken it upon herself to provide sisterly instruction. Yet Sophronia's arrival had introduced an element of unpredictability into the household's measured routines, and Georgiana sometimes caught herself envying her cousin's freedom from the weight of dynastic expectations. The winter of 1817 had brought changes to Ashfield Park. Robert Fitzwilliam, Earl of Harrington, for his father had passed the previous autumn, elevating the heir to his title, had begun making extended visits to the Talbot estate. The wedding had been scheduled for May 1818, and convention dictated that the betrothed couple should establish greater familiarity before their union. These visits, conducted with meticulous propriety, involved formal dinners, chaperoned walks through the gardens, and evening entertainments where Georgiana could display her accomplishments. Robert proved himself a man of breeding and courtesy, if not overwhelming warmth. He possessed a restlessness in his gray eyes, a certain searching quality that Georgiana, in her innocence, mistook for the depths of a passionate spirit, never perceiving it was simply the wandering attention of a man seeking stimulation she, in her controlled perfection, did not provide. At 9 and 20, he carried himself with the confidence befitting his station. He offered appropriate compliments on Georgiana's performances, discussed political matters with her father, and treated his future bride with the respect due to a woman of her rank. Their conversations remained pleasant but superficial, touching upon safe topics that revealed little of either party's inner thoughts. What Georgiana failed to observe, occupied as she was with presenting herself to best advantage, was the manner in which Robert's attention increasingly wandered during these visits. His gaze would drift across the room to where Sophronia sat, working at her embroidery, her expressive face revealing every passing thought and emotion. When Sophronia laughed at something Lady Talbot said, the sound would draw Robert's focus from Georgiana's carefully prepared discourse on agricultural improvement. When the young girl played the harp with more enthusiasm than skill, his expression softened in a way it never did when Georgiana performed technically perfect sonatas. The household staff noticed, for servants always observe what their employers fail to see. Whispers traveled through the servants' hall about how his lordship's eyes followed Miss Sophronia, how he engineered opportunities to be in whatever room she occupied, how his demeanor transformed from formal correctness to animated engagement when speaking with the younger cousin. But such observations remained confined to below stairs, and Georgiana continued in blissful ignorance, perfecting every detail of the wedding arrangements. By April, the preparations had reached fever pitch. 300 invitations had been dispatched to the most elevated members of the ton. The Prince Regent himself had graciously accepted, as had the Prime Minister and half the House of Lords. The ceremony would take place in the ancestral chapel at Harrington House in Nottinghamshire, a magnificent structure dating to the Tudor period. Georgiana's trousseau filled 3 trunks, each garment commissioned from London's finest modistes. The wedding breakfast menu had been planned with the precision of a military campaign. Every element reflected the importance of the union between 2 great families. Georgiana spent her final weeks as an unmarried lady in a state of dreamlike anticipation. Soon she would assume her place as Countess of Harrington, mistress of one of England's grandest estates. More importantly, she would finally begin the companionate marriage she had imagined for so long. Robert had seemed more distracted during his recent visits, but she attributed this to the pressures of his new responsibilities as Earl. Once they were wed and settled into their life together, surely the connection she envisioned would flourish. The night before her departure for Nottinghamshire, Georgiana stood once more at her window, gazing at the familiar landscape of her childhood home. Tomorrow, her life would change forever. She felt ready, prepared by years of training for this moment. What she could not know, what her trusting heart could not conceive, was that all her careful preparation would prove utterly useless for the ordeal that awaited her. The morning of the 12th of May dawned with the sort of crystalline perfection that seemed ordained by Providence itself. Sunlight streamed through the mullioned windows of the bridal chamber at Harrington House, illuminating the exquisite gown laid across the bed like a promise. Georgiana had scarce slept, her mind too occupied with the momentous day ahead to surrender to rest, yet excitement masked any fatigue. Today, finally, her prepared for destiny would become reality. The household had been astir since dawn. Lady Talbot, her mother, fluttered about issuing contradictory instructions to the ladies' maids while dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Sophronia, serving as one of the bridesmaids, appeared unusually subdued, her customary vivacity dimmed by some private trouble. When Georgiana attempted conversation, her cousin offered only monosyllabic responses while avoiding direct eye contact. Georgiana attributed this behavior to nervousness about performing her duties properly in such august company. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of delicate craftsmanship, ivory silk overlaid with Brussels lace, seed pearls stitched in intricate patterns across the bodice, sleeves of gossamer thin fabric that whispered with every movement. As the maids fastened each tiny button and arranged every fold with precision, Georgiana studied her reflection in the looking-glass. The woman who gazed back appeared serene and regal, every inch a countess. Only she could detect the trembling anticipation beneath the composed exterior. The veil, an heirloom from the Fitzwilliam family, cascaded from a delicate coronet of orange blossoms. As it was arranged over her elaborately dressed hair, Georgiana felt the weight of history settling upon her shoulders. Countless countesses of Harrington had worn this veil on their wedding days. Now she would join their ranks, taking her place in an unbroken chain of aristocratic marriages stretching back generations. The chapel at Harrington House represented medieval Gothic architecture at its most sublime. Soaring stone arches rose toward heaven, their surfaces carved with the intricate detail beloved by craftsmen of earlier centuries. Stained glass windows, gifts from various Fitzwilliam ancestors, cast jeweled patterns of colored light across the stone floors. The pews, crafted from ancient oak, could accommodate 300 guests with room to spare. By 11 o'clock, those guests had assembled in a glittering display of wealth, power, and social consequence. The cream of British society filled every seat. Dukes and duchesses, marquises and their wives, earls and viscounts in impressive numbers, influential members of parliament, military heroes bedecked with medals, and various connections to the royal family. The Prince Regent himself occupied a place of honor, his considerable girth draped in purple velvet. The Prime Minister sat nearby, engaging in whispered political discourse with a cabinet minister. Every person of importance within 200 miles had contrived to receive an invitation to this union of two great families. The marriage represented more than the joining of two individuals. It symbolized the consolidation of power, wealth, and influence. The Talbot lands in Derbyshire would eventually combine with the extensive Harrington holdings across Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire, creating an agricultural empire of staggering proportions. The political alliances would strengthen both families' positions in Parliament. The bloodlines, both impeccable, would produce heirs of unimpeachable aristocratic credentials. It was, in every sense, a perfect match. Georgiana waited in the vestibule, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm, as the final guests took their seats. Through the partially opened door, she could glimpse the altar where Robert stood with his groomsmen. Even from this distance, she could see he appeared pale, almost strained. though she supposed all bridegrooms experienced nervousness. Soon they would speak their vows, and this long-anticipated moment would transform into lived reality. The organist began the opening measures of the processional. The congregation rose as one, their collective rustling creating a sound like wind through autumn leaves. Lord Talbot straightened his shoulders and led his daughter forward into the chapel, their measured pace timed to the music. Georgiana's heart hammered beneath her corset, so loudly she imagined everyone must hear it, yet she maintained her serene expression. As they proceeded down the aisle, she became aware of the collective gaze fixed upon her. 300 pairs of eyes assessed every detail: the perfection of her gown, the grace of her carriage, the suitability of her appearance for the role she would assume. She had been trained for precisely this scrutiny, and she met it with the poise expected of a future countess. Yet beneath the training, a young woman's heart fluttered with the enormity of the moment. Robert stood at the altar, flanked by his groomsmen, as Georgiana and her father approached. She searched his face for some sign of the tender regard she had convinced herself existed between them. What she found instead sent the first whisper of unease through her carefully maintained composure. His expression held not joy, not even satisfaction, but rather something that resembled anguish, barely contained. Lord Talbot placed Georgiana's hand in Robert's according to tradition, then stepped back to take his seat. Her hand felt cold despite her gloves. His felt colder still. The Archbishop of York, secured for this important ceremony through the Fitzwilliam family's considerable influence, opened his prayer book and began the ancient words of the marriage service. The Archbishop's voice filled the chapel with sonorous authority, intoning the time-honored phrases that had joined countless couples throughout the centuries. Georgiana barely heard the opening prayers, so focused was she on maintaining her composure against the growing sense that something fundamental was amiss. Robert's hand trembled in hers. His gaze remained fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder, rather than on her face. When the Archbishop reached the critical question, whether any person present knew of impediment to this union, the expected silence should have followed. Instead, Robert drew a sharp breath that seemed to echo through the vast space. Georgiana felt him stiffen beside her, felt his hand clench convulsively around hers. Then, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the chapel, Robert Fitzwilliam spoke the words that would shatter her world. He could not proceed with this marriage. He could not pledge himself to Miss Georgiana Talbot when his heart, his entire being, belonged to another. The chapel erupted. Gasps of shock transformed into a rising tide of scandalized whispers. The Archbishop's prayer book fell from his hands, landing with a thud that punctuated the moment. Georgiana stood frozen, unable to process what she had heard. Surely mishearing, surely misunderstanding, because such things did not happen at aristocratic weddings before 300 witnesses. But Robert continued speaking, his voice gaining strength as the words poured forth like a confession held too long in check. During his visits to Ashfield Park, while fulfilling his obligation to become better acquainted with his betrothed, he had discovered what true feeling meant. He had encountered a spirit that called to his own, a presence that illuminated every room she entered, a woman whose genuine warmth and spontaneous joy had awakened emotions he had never imagined possible. He spoke of his attempts to suppress these feelings, to honor the contract signed before either he or Georgiana could walk. He described weeks of internal torment, wrestling with duty against the dictates of his heart. But he could not, would not, condemn himself and Georgiana to a marriage devoid of true affection when he now understood what love could be. And then, as Georgiana's mind reeled from these revelations, Robert turned his gaze past her to where the bridesmaids stood in their matching gowns of palest green. His eyes found Sophronia, who had gone white as death itself, tears streaming unchecked down her face. He declared before God and 300 witnesses that he loved Lady Sophronia Talbot. He had fought against this truth, knowing the devastation it would cause, but he could no longer live a lie. If he wed Georgiana under these circumstances, he would wrong them both irreparably. Better the temporary pain of public humiliation than a lifetime of marital misery. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Sophronia's choked sob. Every eye in the chapel had turned from the bride to her cousin, witnessing the younger woman's anguished denial, even as her tears confirmed the truth of Robert's confession. Georgiana stood at the altar in her beautiful gown and heirloom veil, hand still clasped in her betrothed's, and felt the careful construction of her entire life crumble to dust. The future she had envisioned, the role she had trained for, the man she had convinced herself she would grow to love, all of it dissolved in the face of Robert's terrible honesty. She became aware of her father's apoplectic rage, his face purple as he shouted about contracts and honor and legal repercussions. Lady Talbot had collapsed in her pew, being attended by concerned neighbors with smelling salts. The Prince Regent himself appeared thunderstruck, while the Prime Minister was already calculating the political implications. The Archbishop stood helpless, his prayer book still lying forgotten on the floor, with no precedent in his decades of service for handling such an unprecedented breach of propriety. And yet, even as shock threatened to overwhelm her, some core of strength forged through years of disciplined training asserted itself. Georgiana would not collapse. She would not scream or weep or rage before this audience. Whatever private anguish tore through her heart, she would not provide further entertainment for the assembled masses. With hands that trembled only slightly, Georgiana reached up and removed the Fitzwilliam veil from her head. The ancient lace caught briefly on her coronet of orange blossoms before falling free. She held it for a moment, this symbol of a future that would never be, then carefully placed it on the altar between herself and Robert. She withdrew her hand from his clasp, noting with strange detachment how cold her fingers had become. Then, gathering her skirts to prevent herself from tripping on the elaborate train, Georgiana Talbot walked back down the aisle she had so recently processed up with such hopeful anticipation. Every face turned to watch her passage. Some expressions held pity, others schadenfreude, still others simply shock. She met none of them, keeping her gaze fixed straight ahead on the chapel doors and the escape they represented. Her ivory silk gown, so perfect just moments ago, now felt like a costume for a play that had transformed from romance to tragedy. She reached the vestibule, passed through the doors, and emerged into the May sunshine that seemed mockingly cheerful. A carriage stood waiting, not the elaborate equipage that should have carried the new Countess of Harrington to her wedding breakfast, but her father's traveling coach. Without waiting for assistance, Georgiana climbed inside, her voluminous skirts making the process awkward but manageable. Only when the carriage door closed, finally granting her privacy, did Georgiana allow the composed mask to crack. Her breath came in gasps, her vision blurred with unshed tears. The entire edifice of her carefully constructed future had collapsed, and she had no conception of what would rise in its place. Behind her, in the chapel, chaos surely reigned. But Georgiana was past caring about the social aftermath, the scandal, the consequences. In this moment, alone in the carriage wearing a wedding gown she would never need, she confronted the devastating truth. The man she had been bound to since infancy had found love, just not with her. Her cousin, the girl she had welcomed into her home with sisterly affection, had stolen the heart she had assumed would someday be hers. And 300 witnesses had watched it all unfold. Ashfield Park, which Georgiana reached shortly after nightfall, offered no comfort. The house that had been her home for 23 years now felt like a mausoleum of shattered dreams. Lord Talbot arrived hours later, still trembling with rage, immediately closeting himself in his study with his solicitors to determine what legal recourse existed against Robert Fitzwilliam for breach of contract. Lady Talbot took to her bed with a sick headache and a conviction that she would never again show her face in society. Sophronia, who had been brought home in a separate carriage, remained sequestered in her chamber, refusing all attempts at communication. The scandal traveled with supernatural speed. By the following morning, every household within 30 miles had received detailed accounts from servants whose employers had attended the aborted ceremony. Within 3 days, the London papers carried carefully worded notices that somehow managed to convey the full scope of the disaster while maintaining the pretense of discretion. Within a week, every drawing room in England buzzed with speculation and commentary. Georgiana endured 5 days of this suffocating atmosphere before reaching her decision. She could not remain at Ashfield, where every corridor held memories of preparing for a future that would never arrive. She could not face the pitying looks from servants who had helped her dress for her wedding. She could not bear the oppressive silence that had descended upon the household, broken only by her father's intermittent bursts of fury and her mother's quietly persistent weeping. On the morning of the 6th day after the debacle, Georgiana informed her parents that she would be accepting the standing invitation of Lady Meredith, her father's eccentric unmarried sister, to visit her establishment in Bath. Lady Meredith, who at 55 had long since ceased caring for society's opinion, had written a characteristically blunt letter expressing her view that Georgiana had escaped a marriage to a man lacking both sense and honor, and would be most welcome to rusticate in Bath until the furore subsided. Lord Talbot, exhausted by his futile attempts to salvage something from the catastrophe, offered no objection. Lady Talbot, too overcome by the shame of their circumstances, merely waved a limp hand in assent. Thus, with a single trunk of necessities and her lady's maid for propriety, Georgiana departed for Somerset, leaving behind everything she had known. Bath, that elegant city of honey-colored stone and healing waters, received her with the anonymity she craved. Lady Meredith's residence on the Royal Crescent offered both comfort and respite from scrutiny. Her aunt, a woman of independent means and even more independent mind, greeted Georgiana with a bracing lack of sympathy that proved paradoxically soothing. Lady Meredith declared that any man who would abandon a bride at the altar possessed neither honor nor sense, that Georgiana had been saved from a marriage that would have brought only misery, and that the current scandal would be replaced by fresh gossip within a month. She prescribed long walks, attendance at the pump room to demonstrate Georgiana had nothing to hide, and the cultivation of pursuits beyond the narrow confines of preparing to be a countess. The first weeks in Bath passed in a strange suspension of time. Georgiana walked the city's elegant crescents and terraces, her maid trailing behind, absorbing the beautiful architecture and the relative anonymity provided by a population largely composed of elderly invalids more concerned with their ailments than with scandal. She attended services at the Abbey, finding solace in the soaring Gothic spaces so different from the chapel where her life had shattered. She took the waters at the pump room, though more to satisfy Lady Meredith than from any belief in their curative properties. What she did not do was think about Robert Fitzwilliam or Sophronia. That way lay madness. Instead, she focused on surviving each day, on reconstructing some sense of identity beyond the bride abandoned at the altar. It proved more difficult than anticipated. For 23 years, her entire existence had centered on preparing to be Countess of Harrington. Without that destination, she felt unmoored, purposeless. Summer progressed into early autumn. The social season in Bath began in earnest as families arrived to escape the worst of London's heat. Lady Meredith, who had retired from active social life but maintained strategic friendships, began dragging Georgiana to various gatherings, musical evenings, lectures at the assembly rooms, private dinners with carefully selected guests. Georgiana attended these events with dutiful compliance, but little enthusiasm. She made polite conversation when addressed, smiled at appropriate moments, and otherwise remained largely invisible. She had perfected the art of being present without actually participating, a skill that served her well in navigating social situations she would have preferred to avoid entirely. It was at one such event, a lecture on recent archaeological discoveries in Italy, that her carefully maintained invisibility first cracked. The speaker, a scholar recently returned from excavations near Pompeii, described the ancient civilization with such passionate enthusiasm that even Georgiana found herself leaning forward in her seat. The musty smell of the lecture hall faded from her awareness. The murmur of the audience transformed into distant buzzing. When he touched upon the role of women in Roman society, mentioning evidence of female property ownership and business management, a spark of her old intellectual curiosity pierced through months of numbness, bringing with it the first genuine flicker of interest she had experienced since that dreadful day in May. During the interval, as other attendees clustered around refreshment tables, Georgiana found herself approaching the speaker to inquire about his research. The gentleman, surprised but clearly pleased by her informed questions, responded with increasing animation. Their conversation ranged across topics she had studied during her comprehensive education: classical languages, historical trade routes, comparative cultural practices, and she felt intellectual muscles, long dormant, beginning to flex once more. They were thus engaged when Lady Meredith appeared with a gentleman in tow. The stranger, introduced as Alessandro Farnese, Conte di Ravenna, had been standing nearby and expressed particular interest in meeting the young lady capable of discussing Cicero's agricultural treatises with such fluency. His English carried the musical lilt of Italian influence, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that suggested he was assessing her mind rather than merely her appearance. The conversation that followed proved unlike any Georgiana had experienced during her London seasons or indeed throughout her entire life. The Conte engaged her as an intellectual equal, building upon her observations rather than patronizingly correcting them, challenging her assertions with respect rather than condescension. When she referenced a philosophical text, he did not appear shocked that a lady would read such material, but instead offered a contrasting interpretation that sparked genuine debate. For the first time since that dreadful day in May, Georgiana felt herself coming alive. Not as the perfectly trained future countess, not as the humiliated bride, but as herself, a woman of intelligence and education with thoughts worth hearing. The sensation proved both exhilarating and terrifying. The evening concluded with the Conte expressing hope that they might continue their discussion at some future occasion. Lady Meredith, whose matchmaking instincts had not entirely atrophied despite her retirement from society, immediately invited him to dine at the Royal Crescent later that week. Georgiana, still dazed by the unexpected pleasure of genuine intellectual discourse, offered no objection. Thus began an autumn of cautious rediscovery. The Conte di Ravenna proved a frequent visitor to Lady Meredith's establishment, always with some pretext: a new book he thought might interest Georgiana, an invitation to view a private art collection, a request for her opinion on a diplomatic matter. Their conversations ranged far beyond the safe topics typically permitted between unmarried ladies and gentlemen. They discussed politics and philosophy, art and agriculture, social reform and economic theory. Alessandro, for he had requested she call him by his given name, Italian informality being more forgiving than English strictures, treated her as he might treat a male colleague of equal standing. He valued her opinions, sought her perspective, and challenged her to defend her positions with rigorous logic. He also gradually revealed aspects of his own life. His work as an unofficial diplomatic liaison between the Italian states and Britain, his efforts to modernize agricultural practices on his family's estates near Ravenna, his frustration with the political fragmentation that hindered Italian development. He mentioned, with careful delicacy, that he was aware of her circumstances. The scandal had reached even Italian ears, carried by gossips who traveled between London and the continent. But rather than treating her as damaged goods, as English society would have done, Alessandro expressed the view that a woman who could maintain her dignity under such circumstances possessed strength of character worth far more than an unstained reputation. What he did not voice aloud was that the fragility of his first wife, though charming, had left him unprepared for her sudden loss to fever, and he now recognized in Georgiana's resilience a beauty of a different and far more enduring sort. This perspective, so foreign to English sensibilities, initially shocked Georgiana. Yet she found herself drawn to the Italian philosophy that valued substance over appearance, that measured worth by response to adversity rather than by absence of trial. In Alessandro's worldview, she was not a pitiable victim, but rather a woman who had demonstrated remarkable fortitude. Their relationship developed with the slow progression of genuine friendship. Unlike the formal, chaperoned encounters with Robert, which had been designed to verify mutual suitability rather than foster actual connection, Georgiana's time with Alessandro felt organic and unforced. Lady Meredith served as nominal chaperone, but her conception of propriety leaned more toward Italian permissiveness than English rigidity. By November, as Bath's autumn fogs rolled in from the surrounding hills, Georgiana realized with some surprise that she looked forward to Alessandro's visits with an anticipation entirely different from the dutiful expectation she had felt regarding her arranged marriage. She valued his mind, respected his principles, and appreciated his company. Whether this constituted romantic feeling, she could not determine. Her previous understanding of romance had proven so thoroughly faulty that she no longer trusted her own judgment in such matters. Alessandro, for his part, made no declarations or demands. He simply continued to appear, to converse, to treat her as though her thoughts mattered as much as her face. He showed her maps of his estates, explaining his plans for agricultural innovation and seeking her input on management strategies. He shared letters from Italian colleagues, translating passages he thought might interest her. He invited her to Italian musical evenings at the homes of fellow expatriates, where she discovered a love for operatic arias sung with passionate intensity. When winter arrived and most of Bath's temporary residents returned to their country estates, Alessandro remained. His diplomatic business, he explained, required his continued presence in England. That this business happened to keep him in Bath rather than London seemed, to Georgiana at least, a rather transparent excuse. Yet she found herself grateful for his presence rather than analyzing his motives too closely. December brought snow to Somerset, transforming Bath into a crystalline wonderland. On a particularly cold afternoon, as they walked through the frost-covered Sydney Gardens, Alessandro finally broached the subject they had carefully avoided. He spoke of marriage, not as an institution of contractual obligation, as Georgiana had always known it, but as a partnership between equals who chose to build a life together. He described the role of Italian noblewomen differently from their English counterparts. In Italy, wives of landowners often actively participated in estate management. They were consulted on business decisions. Their education was valued for practical application rather than merely ornamental display. A Contessa di Ravenna would be expected to use her intelligence to contribute substantively to the management of the family holdings. Alessandro spoke theoretically, couching his observations in general terms. But Georgiana understood the subtext. He was showing her what her life might be if she chose to leave England behind, to embrace a culture that would value her for attributes beyond her breeding and training in feminine accomplishments. Yet he made no specific proposal, applied no pressure. He simply painted a picture and left her to contemplate whether such a future might appeal. The contrast with her previous betrothal, arranged before she could voice any preference, could not have been more stark. Christmas approached, bringing with it an unexpected summons from Ashfield Park. Lord Talbot required his daughter's presence for the holiday, the terse note explained, as the family should present a united front during the season. The message, devoid of any paternal warmth, made clear this was command rather than invitation. Georgiana departed Bath with reluctance, leaving behind the peaceful refuge Lady Meredith had provided and the companionable friendship Alessandro represented. The journey to Derbyshire seemed to traverse not merely miles, but entire worlds, from a place where she had begun to discover herself to one where she remained forever defined by her abandoned wedding. Ashfield Park greeted her with oppressive silence. Lord Talbot barely acknowledged her arrival, immediately returning to his study where he spent increasing amounts of time attempting to salvage the family's social standing. Lady Talbot fluttered nervously, avoiding any mention of the scandal, while simultaneously conveying through every gesture her conviction that Georgiana had somehow been complicit in her own humiliation. Most distressing was the presence of Sophronia, who had remained at Ashfield these past months in a state approaching house arrest. The younger woman had aged visibly, her vivacious spirit extinguished. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands moved restlessly, never still. When she encountered Georgiana in the corridor, she flinched as though expecting physical violence. That evening, unable to bear the tension any longer, Georgiana went to Sophronia's chamber. She found her cousin seated by the window, staring out at the frozen landscape with an expression of absolute desolation. When Georgiana entered, Sophronia began to weep, silent tears that streamed down her face without accompanying sobs. Through halting words and long pauses, the true story emerged. Sophronia had not pursued Robert. She had not encouraged his attentions or welcomed his declarations. She had, in fact, been horrified when she gradually realized the direction of his feelings. She had attempted to discourage him, to maintain proper distance, but Robert's infatuation had proven impervious to her subtle rebuffs. The night before the wedding, Robert had come to her chamber, a breach of propriety so egregious that its discovery would have ruined them both. He had declared his intentions to halt the ceremony, to confess his feelings publicly. Sophronia had begged him to reconsider, to honor his commitment to Georgiana, to recognize that his infatuation would fade while the destruction it caused would endure forever. But Robert had proven intractable in his romantic delusions. He insisted that true love justified any action, that denying his feelings would be living a lie, that future happiness justified present pain. Sophronia's pleas fell on deaf ears, her practical objections dismissed as timidity. The aftermath had been devastating for the younger woman. Lord Talbot blamed her for seducing his daughter's betrothed, despite her protests of innocence. Lady Talbot treated her with cold suspicion, convinced no woman could inspire such passion without deliberate encouragement. Society, naturally, cast Sophronia as the scheming temptress who had stolen her cousin's rightful husband. Robert himself had vanished after the debacle, retreating to his northern estates without attempting further contact with either Talbot cousin. His grand romantic gesture had evidently not included consideration of the actual woman who had inspired it. Sophronia remained at Ashfield Park, trapped in disgrace not of her making, unable to venture into society, her prospects for respectable marriage utterly destroyed. As Georgiana listened to this tale of shared victimhood, something shifted within her. The resentment she had harbored toward her cousin dissolved in the face of Sophronia's genuine anguish. Both women had been casualties of Robert's selfish romanticism, sacrificed to his conception of grand passion without regard for the actual consequences of his actions. They spoke through the night, these two cousins whose lives had been upended by circumstances beyond their control. Sophronia confessed her terror of remaining forever at Ashfield Park, a prisoner of scandal, her youth wasting away under the weight of unearned shame. Georgiana shared her own journey toward discovering an identity beyond the role she had been trained to fulfill. When dawn broke over the frozen Derbyshire landscape, they had reached an understanding. Neither woman had betrayed the other. Robert Fitzwilliam bore sole responsibility for the disaster that had engulfed them both. Whatever path forward existed, recrimination between the cousins served no purpose. The remainder of Georgiana's stay at Ashfield passed with slight improvement in the household atmosphere. Lord Talbot remained absorbed in his own concerns, but Lady Talbot, observing the reconciliation between her daughter and niece, softened somewhat. On Twelfth Night, as the Christmas season concluded, Georgiana prepared to return to Bath with a clearer conscience regarding her cousin. Before her departure, she sought out Lord Talbot in his study. She presented a proposal. Sophronia should be permitted to accompany her to Bath. Lady Meredith's household offered refuge from the scandal, and Bath's society, composed largely of those who had their own reasons for retreating from London, might prove more forgiving than Derbyshire neighbours. Lord Talbot, relieved at the prospect of removing the source of gossip from his immediate vicinity, agreed with surprising alacrity. Thus, when Georgiana's carriage departed Ashfield on a cold January morning, Sophronia accompanied her, both women leaving behind a house that had become a prison. The return to Bath, with Sophronia in tow, initiated a new chapter. Lady Meredith welcomed the younger woman with characteristic briskness, declaring that the best response to scandal was to live well and allow time to eclipse old gossip with fresh. She immediately set about introducing Sophronia to Bath society, with the strategic precision of a military commander. Alessandro greeted Georgiana's return with evident pleasure, though he maintained careful propriety in the presence of the newly arrived cousin. The introduction between Alessandro and Sophronia proved instructive. The Conte treated the younger woman with exactly the same courtesy he extended to Georgiana, neither flirtatious nor accusatory, simply respectful. Sophronia, who had grown accustomed to being treated as either threat or victim, appeared startled by this normalcy. As winter progressed toward spring, the little household on the Royal Crescent established comfortable routines. Both young women accompanied Lady Meredith to various social engagements, gradually rebuilding their confidence in navigating society. Alessandro continued his frequent visits, now serving as escort for both cousins on various excursions. It was during a visit to the Roman baths, that ancient complex of thermal pools and temples, that Alessandro first truly revealed his feelings. The three of them, Alessandro, Georgiana, and Sophronia, had descended into the torchlit chambers where steam rose from heated waters that had flowed for millennia. The atmosphere felt otherworldly, suspended between past and present. As Sophronia wandered ahead to examine an inscription, Alessandro drew Georgiana aside. In low tones barely audible above the echoing drip of water, he spoke of his admiration for her intelligence, his respect for her strength of character, his appreciation for her companionship. He made no flowery declarations or extravagant promises. Instead, he simply stated that he had come to value her presence in his life more highly than he had thought possible. He acknowledged the complications of her circumstances, the scandal that would follow her regardless of distance, the social disapprobation any association with her might inspire. Yet he also expressed his conviction that English obsession with reputation sometimes caused society to punish victims rather than perpetrators. In Italy, a woman of her obvious quality would be judged by her actions and character, not by the failings of a man who had treated her poorly. Alessandro made no specific proposal in that moment, but his meaning was clear. He was offering her the choice to begin again, in a place where her past would matter less than her present self. Unlike the arranged betrothal that had defined her youth, this would be her decision entirely. Georgiana, standing in the steam-filled chamber with ancient Roman stones beneath her feet, felt the weight of the choice before her. She could remain in England, forever marked by scandal, gradually fading into the background of Bath society as a cautionary tale. Or she could embrace the possibility Alessandro offered: a new country, a new language already familiar to her from her education, a new role where her capabilities would be assets rather than merely accomplishments. She asked for time to consider, and Alessandro graciously granted it. The remainder of the winter passed with this unspoken question hanging between them, coloring every interaction with the awareness of potential future or inevitable parting. Spring arrived in Bath with the delicate beauty characteristic of English weather at its finest. The Royal Crescent's gardens burst into bloom, daffodils and crocuses painting cheerful colors against the honey-colored stone. The city filled with new arrivals, seeking the water's curative properties or simply escaping the pressures of London society. Life continued its pleasant rhythm at Lady Meredith's establishment. Then, on a morning in late March, a letter arrived from Nottinghamshire. The handwriting on the envelope belonged to Sophronia's former lady's maid, now in service at Harrington House. Lady Meredith handed the missive to the younger cousin with a significant look, then tactfully withdrew, taking Georgiana with her to allow Sophronia privacy to read. An hour later, Sophronia emerged from her chamber with the letter clutched in trembling hands and an expression of complex emotions: relief, vindication, and profound sadness intermingled. She requested that both Georgiana and Lady Meredith join her in the morning room, for the letter contained information they ought to hear. The contents proved illuminating in the most bitter fashion. The maid, loyal to her former mistress despite the scandal, had written to inform Sophronia of recent developments at Harrington House. Robert Fitzwilliam, Earl of Harrington, had approached Sophronia's father's executors, requesting permission to court the now orphaned lady. Having declared his passion so publicly, he apparently felt obligated to follow through with matrimonial intentions. Sophronia had initially declined his addresses, the maid reported, citing the scandal and her own lack of affection for his lordship. But pressure from various quarters, her limited financial resources, her compromised reputation, the arguments of practical relatives who insisted she would never receive another honorable offer, had eventually worn down her resistance. 3 weeks previous, she had accepted his proposal. The wedding was scheduled for June, a quiet affair with minimal guests given the circumstances. But the maid's letter did not end with mere recitation of facts. With the frankness possible only between longtime servant and mistress, she shared observations that painted a deeply troubling picture. Robert's much-vaunted passion had proven remarkably short-lived. Once the drama of his grand romantic gesture had faded, he had discovered that infatuation, born of stolen glances and forbidden feelings, did not necessarily translate into sustained emotional connection. Sophronia, the maid wrote with barely disguised anger, was miserable. She spent her days learning to manage Harrington House with none of the joy that should accompany a bride's preparations. Robert treated her with distant courtesy rather than ardent devotion. Their conversations rarely ventured beyond necessary practicalities. The man who had been willing to destroy multiple lives for love now seemed almost indifferent to the woman he had claimed to adore. Moreover, the servants' gossip suggested Robert was beginning to realize the magnitude of his error. He had sacrificed his carefully arranged advantageous match, a bride who would have brought political connections, flawless reputation, and proven capability, for a younger woman whose primary appeal had been her unattainability. Now that Sophronia was attainable, indeed unavoidably present, the romance had evaporated like morning dew. Sophronia was also expecting a child. The maid's letter delicately alluded to this development without providing explicit details, but the implication was clear. Whether through premarital indiscretion or simply the natural course of a hasty marriage, a future Earl of Harrington would arrive before year's end. The letter concluded with the maid's fervent hope that her former mistress had found peace in Bath, far from the suffocating unhappiness that permeated Harrington House. She wished Sophronia well and promised to write again with any significant developments. The silence that followed Sophronia's halting recitation of the letter's contents was profound. Lady Meredith recovered first, declaring with characteristic bluntness that Robert Fitzwilliam was a fool who had confused romantic fancy with genuine feeling, and that both young women had been fortunate to escape permanent entanglement with such an individual. For Georgiana, the letter's revelations triggered a cascade of realizations. She had spent months nursing heartbreak over a man who proved himself incapable of sustaining the very passion he had declared worth destroying everything to pursue. She had mourned the loss of a future with someone whose grand romantic gesture masked fundamental selfishness and immaturity. She had believed herself rejected for a love so profound it justified all consequences, only to discover that love had proved as insubstantial as morning mist. The thought was vertiginous. The worst moment of her life, the epicenter of her humiliation, had been, in truth, her salvation. The altar had not been the stage of her ending, but the starting point of her liberation. Had Robert maintained his commitment through the wedding, she would have found herself bound to a man who had romanticized another woman during their entire betrothal. Their marriage would have been hollow, poisoned by his resentment and her ignorance. Instead of this painful but temporary humiliation, she would have endured a lifetime of being the wife her husband settled for, rather than the woman he desired. The letter also crystallized Georgiana's thinking regarding Alessandro's carefully unspoken proposal. She had been holding back, uncertain whether she could trust her judgment after being so thoroughly wrong about Robert. But the situations bore no resemblance. Alessandro had never made grand declarations or dramatic gestures. He had simply, consistently treated her with respect and interest. He valued her mind, sought her opinions, and made no attempt to transform her into some ideal of feminine perfection. More importantly, he offered her a choice. Not a destiny arranged in her infancy, not a role she must fulfill regardless of personal inclination, but an actual decision about the direction of her life. She could accept or decline, and either way, he would respect her autonomy. That evening, Georgiana requested Alessandro call at the Royal Crescent. When he arrived, finding her in Lady Meredith's small private parlor, he immediately sensed something significant had shifted. She invited him to sit, dispensed with preliminary pleasantries, and spoke with direct honesty that would have shocked her younger self raised on feminine circumlocution. She told him about the letter from Nottinghamshire, about Sophronia's unhappy marriage to the man who had destroyed Georgiana's wedding for love. She explained her realization that she had been saved rather than betrayed, liberated rather than abandoned. She acknowledged her growing awareness that the life she had thought she wanted would have stifled the person she was discovering herself to be. Then, with the straightforwardness she had learned from observing his Italian directness, she asked about his intentions. If he had been proposing the possibility of marriage when he spoke of Italian noblewomen's roles, she wished to understand what such an arrangement would entail. She would not enter another situation based on assumptions and romantic fantasies. Alessandro responded with matching honesty. He described his estates near Ravenna, the agricultural innovations he hoped to implement, the political work that occupied much of his time. He explained that he sought a partner who could engage intellectually with these interests, who could manage complex households during his absences, who could navigate both Italian and international society with confidence. He spoke of his previous marriage, cut short by fever after only 3 years, and his determination not to wed again unless he found someone of compatible mind and temperament. He had observed Georgiana for months now, noting her intelligence, her resilience, her capacity for growth. He believed they could build a genuine partnership, but only if she entered into it willingly and with clear understanding of what the life would require. He also acknowledged that taking an English bride marked by scandal might complicate his diplomatic work. Italian society might prove more forgiving than English, but that did not mean the gossip would evaporate entirely. He was willing to weather such complications, but she needed to understand they existed. Most crucially, he made clear that if she chose differently, if she preferred to remain in England, to rebuild her life in Bath or elsewhere, he would not press suit. He valued her happiness above his own desires. The conversation lasted long into the evening, covering practical considerations alongside emotional ones. They discussed everything from estate management to language barriers to the frequency of travel required by his diplomatic duties. Alessandro answered every question with patient thoroughness, hiding nothing, painting no falsely romantic picture of their potential life together. When he finally departed, well after midnight, no formal engagement had been declared. But understanding had been reached. Georgiana had been given complete information and unlimited time to make her decision. The contrast with her previous betrothal could not have been more stark. April in Bath brought weather alternating between spring sunshine and torrential downpours, as though nature itself could not decide its character. Georgiana spent the month in deep contemplation, weighing every aspect of the choice before her. Lady Meredith, displaying uncharacteristic restraint, refrained from offering opinions, though her satisfaction with Alessandro as a potential match was evident. Sophronia, still processing the revelations in her maid's letter, encouraged Georgiana to seize the opportunity for happiness. She spoke with the wisdom of someone who had seen romance without substance crumble into quotidian unhappiness. Alessandro offered something more valuable than passion, she observed. He offered respect, partnership, and genuine regard. Georgiana also wrote to her parents, informing them of Alessandro's interest and requesting their blessing. The response, when it arrived, proved perfunctory. Lord Talbot, still nursing grievances against Robert Fitzwilliam, appeared relieved that his daughter might yet make a respectable match, even if with a foreign nobleman. Lady Talbot expressed hope that Italian society would prove more welcoming than English, though she could not resist adding that a second chance at marriage was more than many disgraced brides received. Their tepid approval liberated rather than disappointed Georgiana. She had spent 23 years seeking parental validation, molding herself to fulfill their expectations. Their indifferent response to this new possibility clarified that she was making this choice for herself, not to satisfy family ambitions. By late April, Georgiana had reached her decision. She sent a note to Alessandro requesting he call at his earliest convenience. When he arrived the following afternoon, she invited him to walk with her in the Royal Crescent Gardens, where spring flowers bloomed in cheerful profusion. They walked in silence for several minutes, Georgiana gathering her thoughts and courage. Then, with the directness she had learned from his example, she accepted his proposal. She would marry him, travel to Italy, build a new life as Contessa di Ravenna. But she articulated conditions. She would not be merely ornamental. She expected to engage actively in estate management, as he had promised. She required assurance that her education and intelligence would be valued assets rather than peculiarities to be tolerated. Alessandro agreed to every stipulation without hesitation. More than agreed, he welcomed them. The marriage they would build, he assured her, would be partnership of equals within the constraints their society permitted. He would never ask her to diminish herself to fit some ideal of passive femininity. They discussed practical arrangements. The wedding would take place in Bath, a small ceremony with only family and close friends in attendance. No grand society event, no elaborate celebrations, simply the legal and spiritual union of two people choosing to build a life together. They would depart for Italy shortly thereafter, settling at his estates outside Ravenna before traveling to other diplomatic destinations as his work required. The announcement, when it appeared in the newspapers, generated predictable gossip. Society gleefully noted that the bride abandoned at the altar had secured a foreign title, proving that scandal need not permanently destroy a woman's prospects. Some praised Alessandro's gallantry in overlooking her damaged reputation. Others suggested he had secured a bargain, a well-educated English bride who came cheaper due to her circumstances. Georgiana found she cared remarkably little for these opinions. She had spent months in Bath discovering that her value did not depend upon society's approval. The people whose regard she valued, Lady Meredith, Sophronia, a handful of genuine friends, supported her choice. The rest was merely noise. The wedding took place on a mild morning in May, 1 year after the debacle at Nottinghamshire. The ceremony, held in a small chapel near the abbey, included only 24 guests. Georgiana wore a simple gown of cream silk with minimal ornamentation, her only jewelry a strand of pearls. No elaborate veil, no dramatic procession, no hundreds of witnesses, just honest exchange of vows between two people who had chosen one another. When the vicar pronounced them married, Georgiana felt no crushing anxiety, no sense of being trapped in someone else's design for her life. Instead, she experienced quiet satisfaction and cautious optimism. Alessandro kissed her hand with gentle formality, and they walked back down the aisle together as Conte and Contessa di Ravenna. The wedding breakfast at Lady Meredith's house was similarly modest, but genuinely joyful. Sophronia, visiting from Nottinghamshire with visible pregnancy and carefully maintained cheer, toasted the bride with champagne and whispered fierce encouragement. Lady Meredith declared it the most sensible wedding she had ever attended, high praise from a woman who valued practicality above sentiment. By evening, Georgiana and Alessandro were traveling toward Portsmouth, where they would board a ship bound for Livorno. The journey would take weeks, but Georgiana felt no impatience. She was leaving England not as an abandoned bride fleeing scandal, but as a woman who had chosen her own path. The Palazzo Farnese stood on a hill overlooking the Adriatic Sea, its ancient stone walls weathered by centuries of Italian sun and sea air. Unlike the formal English country houses Georgiana had known, the palazzo sprawled organically, successive generations having added wings and courtyards according to need rather than symmetrical design. Gardens descended in terraces toward the water, olive groves and vineyards covering slopes that had been cultivated since Roman times. Georgiana arrived in July, when heat shimmered off the pale stones and cicadas sang from every tree. The Italian landscape bore no resemblance to Derbyshire's green hills or Bath's ordered crescents. Everything felt more intense here, the colors brighter, the light harsher, the sounds more immediate. She had entered a completely different world. Alessandro's family welcomed her with warmth that surprised her English sensibilities. His mother, the dowager contessa, embraced her with genuine affection despite limited shared language. His sisters descended en masse, chattering in rapid Italian and admiring her gowns with unabashed enthusiasm. His elderly uncle, who spoke fluent English, appointed himself her tutor in Italian customs and history. The household operated differently from English establishments. Mealtimes followed Italian schedules with light breakfasts, substantial midday dinners, and late evening suppers. The day's rhythm adapted to the heat, with afternoon riposo when everyone retreated to cool interior rooms. Servants addressed the family with familiar affection rather than English formality. Everything felt simultaneously foreign and surprisingly comfortable. Alessandro kept his promise regarding her role. Within weeks of arriving, he began involving her in estate management decisions. They rode together across the property, discussing agricultural innovations and tenant relations. He valued her suggestions about household efficiency, trusting her judgment on complex matters. When diplomatic correspondence arrived in English, he asked her to draft responses, incorporating her political insights. Georgiana discovered that her exhaustive education, designed to make her an ornamental countess, translated beautifully into practical usefulness in Italy. Her language skills facilitated communication with international visitors. Her musical training delighted Italian guests who valued artistic accomplishment. Her understanding of estate management applied directly to overseeing the palazzo's extensive lands. Most significantly, she found that Italian society truly did judge her differently than English society would have done. The scandal that defined her in England barely registered here. When introduced as the contessa who had been dramatically abandoned at the altar, Italians tended to view the story as evidence of exciting romantic drama rather than shameful disgrace. Her dignified handling of the situation earned respect rather than pity. By autumn, Georgiana had established routines that gave shape to her new life. Mornings were spent managing household accounts and corresponding with the estate managers. Middays brought lessons in Italian, which she attacked with the same determination she had once applied to becoming the perfect future countess. Afternoons involved social calls, gradually building relationships with neighboring families. Evenings were reserved for Alessandro, when they would discuss their respective days, debate philosophical questions, or simply read companionably. She also initiated a project particularly close to her heart. Noticing that daughters of tenant farmers received no education beyond basic domestic skills, she proposed establishing a small school on the estate. Alessandro not only approved, but helped her secure suitable premises and recruit a teacher. By winter, 12 girls were learning reading, basic mathematics, and practical skills that would serve them throughout their lives. The work gave Georgiana profound satisfaction. Unlike the ornamental accomplishments she had once cultivated, this contributed tangibly to improving others' circumstances. The girls' parents expressed gratitude that often moved her to tears. She was making a difference, however modest, in her adopted community. Her relationship with Alessandro also deepened naturally over months of shared life. The intellectual companionship that had first drawn them together evolved into genuine affection. She valued his steadiness, his respect for her capabilities, his willingness to treat her as a partner. He appreciated her intelligence, her resilience, her ability to adapt to a completely new culture. They were not Romeo and Juliet, consumed by overwhelming passion. They were something perhaps more valuable, two compatible people building a life together with mutual regard and increasing fondness. Georgiana, who had once believed she wanted grand romance, discovered that steady partnership brought deeper satisfaction than dramatic declarations. By spring of the following year, she was expecting their first child. The pregnancy brought back memories of Sophronia's letter describing her own delicate condition in the unhappy Harrington household. Georgiana wrote to her cousin, a correspondence they had maintained despite distance, sharing the news and inquiring after Sophronia's welfare. The response, when it arrived weeks later, confirmed what the earlier letter had suggested. Sophronia had delivered a son, securing the succession, but her marriage remained one of form rather than substance. Robert treated her with perfunctory courtesy, but little affection. They inhabited the same house whilst living essentially separate lives. Sophronia devoted herself to her son, finding in motherhood the purpose her marriage failed to provide. She wrote without self-pity, having apparently made peace with her circumstances. But between the lines, Georgiana could read the quiet resignation of someone who had sacrificed personal happiness to social necessity. Sophronia's conclusion, however, provided unexpected comfort. She expressed gratitude that Georgiana at least had found genuine contentment. One of them deserved to be happy, she wrote, and it was only fitting that it should be Georgiana who had suffered the greater initial humiliation. As Georgiana's pregnancy advanced through the summer heat, she reflected often on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this terrace overlooking the Adriatic. 2 years ago, she had stood at her window in Ashfield Park, preparing to fulfill the destiny planned since her birth. She had believed she understood what her life would be, Countess of Harrington, mistress of great English estates, fulfilling a role designed by others. That life had been destroyed in the most publicly humiliating manner imaginable. At the time, standing in her wedding gown in that Nottinghamshire chapel, she had believed her life was ending. She could not have conceived that the disaster was actually liberation. The humiliation that had seemed her death had been, in truth, her rebirth, forcing her from the comfortable prison of expectations and compelling her to discover the life she would build for herself, not the one assigned to her. In September, she delivered a healthy daughter, whom they named Juliana. Holding her child while seated on the palazzo terrace, watching sunset paint the Adriatic in shades of gold and crimson, Georgiana experienced contentment that transcended mere happiness. This was the life she had chosen, built through adversity and conscious decision rather than inherited through dynastic arrangement. Letters continued to arrive from England. Sophronia wrote of her son's progress and her increasingly independent life within Harrington House. Lady Meredith sent acerbic commentary on Bath society and satisfaction that her niece had escaped English narrowness. Even Georgiana's parents occasionally corresponded, their notes suggesting grudging pride that she had secured a title despite the scandal. But England felt increasingly distant, a country she had once inhabited rather than home. Home was this palazzo with its chaotic warmth, these Italian seasons of intense heat and sudden storms, this language she now spoke with increasing fluency. Home was Alessandro, whose respect and affection had proven more valuable than Robert's dramatic passion ever could have been. Home was Juliana, the daughter who would grow up in a place that valued women's intelligence alongside their beauty. 2 years after arriving in Italy, Georgiana stood once more on her favorite terrace, watching Alessandro play with their daughter in the garden below. Another child grew within her, due the following spring. The school she had established now taught 20 girls, with demand for more places. The estate prospered under her and Alessandro's joint management. Her Italian flowed smoothly, though she retained the accent that would always mark her as English by birth. She thought occasionally of that day in May when Robert had shattered her carefully constructed future. The memory no longer carried pain, only a sort of distant gratitude. He had hurt her terribly, publicly, in the cruelest manner imaginable. But in destroying her planned life, he had inadvertently given her the opportunity to create a better one. Robert and Sophronia remained trapped in England, bound by a marriage born of infatuation and perpetuated by obligation. Meanwhile, Georgiana had found something infinitely more valuable than passion. She had found purpose, partnership, and the freedom to become fully herself. The sun set over the Adriatic, painting the sky in colors that never graced English horizons. Below, Alessandro called up to her in Italian, inviting her to join him and Juliana. She descended the ancient stone steps, feeling the familiar warmth of sun-soaked stone rising through the soles of her slippers, a heat that Derbyshire had never known. Her hand trailed along walls that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more, feeling the weight of history and possibility combined. She had been trained from birth to be Countess of Harrington, a role that would have slowly suffocated her true self. Instead, she had become Contessa di Ravenna, a woman who built schools and managed estates and partnered with a man who valued her mind. The path to this destination had been agonizing, the public humiliation nearly unbearable. But the destination itself? That was worth every moment of the painful journey. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, though sometimes it must first demolish every expectation to clear the ground for something genuine to take root and flourish.